Thank you so much for coming. The topic of today's Lunch and Learn is the life of St. Maximilian Kolbe, and if you see him over on the windowsill, this is a portrait of him that was painted in 1995, so for the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And we'll be discussing his life and his accomplishments and his sacrifice. And today is a really special day because he was killed on August 14th, 1941. So it's actually been 84 years today, and today is recognized as his feast for his sacrifice. So this is St. Maximilian Kolbe, and this is a poster today at Auschwitz that commemorates him and his experience in Auschwitz. He was born in 1894 and died in 1941 when he was killed in Auschwitz at the age of 47. So he had a fairly short life, but he accomplished so many missions, contributed so much to scholarship, and really helped shape the perspective for the intersection of theology and scholarship, and really redefined what it is to make a true sacrifice and truly honor your values and express the highest love you possibly can, which is to give your life for the love of a friend. So today we'll be talking about him. He was actually born Raymond Kolbe on August 8th, 1894 in Zunskowola, Poland. So this is a modern map of Poland, and the borders have changed a little bit, so we'll talk about it. But he was born essentially about, Zunskowola is a suburb of Lodz, Poland, which is today in central Poland, but was actually more to in the western part of Poland in 1894, but it was actually part of the Russian Empire in 1894 when he was born, because Poland was partitioned between Germany, Austria, and Russia in 1894. This is his family house. His parents were very poor. They were weavers, so his father worked as a weaver. Poland had not industrialized the way Germany had, so they were still working with hand looms and hand spinning wheels. So he was the second of three children. This is the house in Zunskowola where he was born. And here's a map just to show you. That's Lodz right there, and Zunskowola is here. So it's kind of a far out suburb. It's about 25 miles from Lodz. And if you see down here on the map, Częstochowa is actually the site of a very important shrine with this image of Our Lady. That's a very famous shrine in Poland, the site of a historic battle and a miracle, and his parents were both devout. They were very religious, and the family would regularly make pilgrimages to Częstochowa from Lodz. So despite being poor, Poland was very well connected by railways, and people could move fairly freely about the country. This is his mother. Unfortunately, we don't have any surviving photographs of his father, Julius. This is his mother, Mariana. His oldest brother was named Franciszek, and he was born in 1892. Raymond, who later became known as Maximilian, was born in 1894. And their younger brother, Joseph, was born in 1896. And then they had two other brothers born after that who died in infancy. And so they just had the three children that survived. The family moved to Pabianica, which is another suburb of Lodz. And this photograph is from 1902, and it shows the three boys in the children's orchestra in Pabianica. So there was just this great arts education. The boys learned Latin and Greek. Raymond, he excelled in math. But all of the boys were great students, and even though the parents were poor, they provided a very high quality education for their children. Now, something happened when he was about 8 or 10 years old. It's not quite clear if it was when it was, but there was an incident where he disobeyed his mother. He actually wanted a pet chicken, and he went to the neighbor's hen house and stole an egg. Well, the neighbor saw him, and His mother disciplined him physically for this, and he ran to the church, which was just down the street from their house. And it was called the Church of St. Matthew, the Apostle and the Evangelist, and St. Lawrence, the Martyr in Pabianica. So this beautiful church was right down the road from their house. And when his mother disciplined him, she said, "What will become of you, Raymond?" And he went and he asked this beautiful icon in the church, this icon of Our Lady and the infant Christ. He said, "What will become of me?" And he actually saw her step forth from the painting, and see these gilded crowns they have? She handed him 2 crowns when she stepped out of the painting, and one was red and sparkling like rubies, and one was white, sparkling like diamonds. And she said that the red crown symbolized martyrdom, and the white crown symbolized purity, also holiness. And she extended both to him, and he accepted both of them. So at this point, he said, when he was about 9 years old in 1903, that he knew that he was going to die a martyr. That was just how his life would end. And his mother recognized something immediately. At first, she blamed herself for disciplining him, for spanking him. She thought maybe she was too hard because she saw such a change in his personality, that he was so obedient. He told her everything, and she realized that no, this was something very real that happened that caused this transformation in him. And everyone else in his school, they saw the change too, that he became much more quiet, much more reserved, but he also was really leading other students and modeling virtues for them. Again, I mentioned that Poland was not in the same place it is today. There's Lodz over there. This just shows the partition of Poland that happened in the late 1700s and was essentially still in effect until around the turn of the century, right before World War I. So right around World War I, this is the area called Galicia, which today is split between Poland and Ukraine. And but at that time, it was all in Poland. So he traveled to the city of Lvov, or Lviv, as it's now called in Ukraine, to enter the seminary at 13 years old. So he went with his older brother Franciszek in 1907 and joined a conventual friar Franciscan seminary, and that's him at about the age of 16. And he took his initial vows in September of 1910, and it's then that he changed his name to Maximilian from Raymond. So after 1910, he went by Maximilian. After seminary, he traveled in 1912 to Rome, where he actually completed 3 PhDs in addition to finishing his ordination as a priest in Rome. So he received a PhD in philosophy from Gregorian University, a PhD in theology from the University of St. Bonaventure, and he also earned a PhD in physics while he was there. So this is him in seminary. And on April 28th, 1918, during World War I, he was ordained a priest and celebrated his first Mass at the Basilica of Sant'Andrea della Frate in Rome, and it's commemorated there today. His first Mass, as you can see, 29 April, is commemorated. And it was at this time that he really had formative experiences. Despite being a very successful student, he actually realized that he was better able to reach people by speaking to people just on the street or in the train, and realized that there were people of all different faiths who all had a perspective, and he really wanted to understand where people were coming from, but also reach them with faith in new ways. It was also at the time of World War I. So in 1917, that was the height of the Bolshevik Revolution. He saw a lot of anti-clerical propaganda, even in the Vatican at that time. There was a lot of support for the purge of the clergy that was happening in the Soviet Union. There were people that saw that the clergy was in some ways connected to the monarchy. They were blaming them for World War I, and he saw a lot of different political groups and protests in Rome that were actually supporting things that he saw as destructive to religion and particularly destructive to society, despite the war going on. So it's at this time that he really saw that his mission was to reach people and to bring them to faith in the best way he could. And he saw that he wasn't necessarily going to do that by being a university professor. Also, he started struggling with tuberculosis at this time, and tuberculosis did not have a cure before World War II because they didn't have antibiotics. So it was something that they really just managed, and at that point, Rome was already very polluted. Everybody was smoking there, and the recommendation was that he go back to Poland just for a cleaner environment because he was so sick. So when he gets back to Poland, he sees that really the best way to reach people with his mission is not just to stay in the monastery, but his dream is really to publish, but to publish a popular newspaper. So this newspaper is called HERC Niepokalanów, which means Knight of the Immaculate. And he realized that motivating people with a lot of medieval chivalry and a call to older chivalry, heroism, was very motivating for people, especially after World War II, where soldiers felt defeated, they felt used, and were struggling and looking for motivation. So on January 22nd, he published the first edition of this monthly newspaper in 1922. And then initially, it started out at a circulation of 5,000 copies a month, but it eventually grew to over 1 million copies a month. So that's what his monastery was focusing on. They went to Grodno, which is today in Belarus, but at that time was Poland. And all of these other friars with him were really focused on their mission, which was publication. And there was some politics in it, but he didn't want to get into the weeds of politics because he saw how it split people. So he really wanted to talk about themes of love and unity and transcending all of the political fighting that was going on in Europe at this time. So this is him with his younger brother, Joseph, who actually followed in his footsteps and became ordained as a priest as well. His older brother decided I think he met a lady when he was in Rome, and he dropped out of seminary and went to go pursue a life being married. But his younger brother took the name of Alphonse. His name was Joseph, and he moved to Grodno with his brother in the 1920s and helped with this mission of making this newspaper. But he had a dream of having an even bigger monastery that would function as its own self-sustaining city. So he really had a dream of mobilizing all of these brothers into a city where they could really publish, live, work, and help as many people as possible. So it was in 1927 he secured the land for what would become what's now known as Niepokalanów, which translates to the City of the Immaculate, or the City of the Immaculata. And their dream was to make an entirely self-sustaining monastery. It had a farm. He had a PhD in physics, so firefighting was one of his biggest passions. He was interested in infrastructure. He saw how things were modernizing, but also how they could use technology to help as many people and continue their mission of educating people and reaching people with a newspaper. This is the dedication in 1927. That's the consecration of the statue of the Immaculate Conception. And this is Maximilian Kolbe with his brother as the site was being constructed in 1928. But just as soon as he gets this monastery established, he realizes that he wants to go other places and take his mission to other parts of the world. So in February 1930, he leaves for Japan with the mission of replicating the exact same monastery, the exact same newspaper, and the exact same mission, but in Japan, so they could reach more people. This is a picture of them in Saigon in April 1930 on their way to Nagasaki. I should say that right when he got to Japan in 1930, his brother, who was still in Poland, died of a ruptured appendix. So it was sad. His brother was decided to stay in Poland to continue the mission there while he went to Japan, but sadly he never saw his brother again because his brother died of a ruptured appendix. But despite being very sad about the loss of his brother, he continued the mission, and he essentially continued the construction project, building according to very similar plans, what became known as the Mugenzi no Sono, which is the Garden of the Immaculata in Japan. And what's really special about this, when they were constructing it, they actually constructed on the opposite side of the mountain from the town. And everyone kept saying, well, why would you build it there? Why would you build it away from the infrastructure and the road and the city and the water? And he kept saying that, no, we need to build this. Our Lady, I prayed about it, and she told me that we need to build here. And in 1945, this comes back to be very significant when there's a historic event in 1945 in Nagasaki. But even though he didn't know Japanese at all when he started, he only knew Latin, but the monks in Japan also knew Latin, so they used Latin to communicate. And he slowly learned Japanese and Chinese while he was there too, because he wanted to reach as many people as possible, even though they first started writing the newspaper in Latin and then translating it into Japanese and Chinese. He continued to learn Japanese because he wanted to be able to speak to people and talk to people individually. So this is the Seibo no Kishi. It's the Japanese version of the Night of the Immaculata. And the circulation was over 100,000 copies a month. And how he got so successful was he said he wanted to sell the paper at cost. That was it. They didn't make a profit. He just wanted to cover the cost of what it took to make the materials, because it was for him about the message more than about the money. And this caused a lot of friction in his monasteries, because obviously it was so popular they could have made a profit, but they chose not to. So that's his desk. And despite being so academically inclined, he really preferred just writing short, accessible prose that was on a level that everybody could understand. And that's his office in the Japanese Neopokalanov in 1931 or 1931 to 1933. These are just some pictures of the building of the garden. He built a replica of the grotto at Lourdes, which is another site of an appearance of Our Lady that was from 1858 in France. But he used this story and this statue to encourage people and to perpetuate his mission, which was to bring more people to faith and unite more people around values of love. So here he is with the seminarians in Nagasaki. This is just another picture of the same thing. Today there are murals on the wall that show him teaching. He also reached people that he saw his mission was anyone over the age of 7 could be considered a Knight of the Immaculate, because he saw children as being fully capable. And he wrote on a level that he really wanted his newspaper to be accessible to kids too. So he had a kids version of it, the Night of the Immaculata, and he focused a lot on early education too, because he saw that as being a higher priority for him than college age education. In 1936, he moves back to Poland. By this point, the Neopokalanov that he founded in Poland now had over 700 monks. They had a fire station, a farm. They were truly self-sustaining. They could grow their own food, and this became very important as the winds of World War II came. Food distribution became harder, and they were able to support and help as many people in the local area as possible. And Neopokalanov is just outside of Warsaw, so they had access to the city, but they were still very much in the countryside. So here's a picture of him with firefighters at Neopokalanov, instructing them in techniques. This is, that's a car, that's a visitor. And in the late 1930s, they started noticing that propaganda was becoming much more prevalent in Germany and in Poland. And specifically, he noticed this connection between anti-Semitic propaganda, which was promulgated especially in this newspaper called Der Stürmer, which means the attacker. If you've ever heard of the brown shirts or stormtroopers, they're the SA, they are the Sturmabteilung, the stormtroopers. So the storm is a recurring theme in a lot of Nazi rhetoric. And there was, in addition to anti-Semitic propaganda, there was this connection of Catholic priests, communists, and Jewish rabbis. So it was sort of in this Nazi rhetoric that was escalating, Catholics were included in this group of enemies of the state or enemies of the Nazi ideology. And he noticed this and realized that, no, they needed to have a newspaper that was much more politically inclined and very much to counter a lot of the propaganda. He saw it as propaganda, but propaganda of truth and virtue. So Malý is the newspaper that they began to publish in 1935, from 1935 to 1939. And it was a daily journal. So this was every day a newspaper, and the circulation was up to 120,000 copies a day. So he just expanded the mission of reaching as many people as possible with messages that were rooted in truth, and to try to offer a balance of all of the overwhelming Nazi propaganda that was coming from the mass media at the time. In 1938, he also realized that Nazi Germany was using a lot of radio to communicate propaganda. So he had established on December 8th, 1938 at Neopokalanów in this building, a radio station. So they ended up having talk radio that was just to give people a more balanced perspective. And at this time, they didn't keep the best records, but as life was becoming increasingly challenging for the Jews, more Jews were being persecuted, Neopokalanów was actually able to hide over 2,000 Jewish people and connect with a network outside of Warsaw, because they saw that they were being persecuted, they were being taken from their homes, their businesses were being taken from them. So they worked very hard with the Polish underground and the Polish resistance to try to support as many Jewish people as they could. Unfortunately, in 1939, Hitler invades Poland and everything changes. Overnight, Poland becomes a part of Nazi Germany, and not more, just 2.5 weeks after September 1st, when Nazi Germany invades Poland, Neopokalanów is raided because there were a lot of people that knew the kind of work they were doing and their opposition to the Nazis. So this is a painted representation of the arrest. The Wehrmacht came and arrested over 100 of the monks at the monastery and ransacked their monastery, their files, and stopped operations on their newspaper. This just shows you September 1st, 1939, the day the war began. And then this photograph is actually from the 19th of September, 1939, showing the arrest of the friars at the monastery. So this is them all being taken to an internment camp. They were in 3 different internment camps, but this was taken at the 21st Stalag. And what's funny is it was a very challenging time being in an internment camp. It wasn't totally lethal, but at the same time, it was very punishing. There were shortages of food. They were intense. It was cold. It was rainy. But Maximilian Kolbe just encouraged everyone, reassured them, and he actually worked closely with the commandant of this camp, who actually he became friends with, and he allowed them to continue to pray, and they were eventually released in December 1939 after spending 3 months imprisoned, and they stayed friends with the commandant. So, I mean, he was able to gain sympathy, and not just sympathy, it was just through reason and truth and respect that they had a respectful relationship with each other, and he really came to support their mission despite being restricted by his office as an SS officer. But he tried to support them as much as he could until 1941. Unfortunately, in 1941, he was arrested again by the Gestapo. This is the last picture we know of him. And this is a painting depicting his arrest on February 17th, 1941. And this time he was taken to the notorious Pawiak prison in Warsaw. And this is a painted representation of him in prison. And while we don't have the clearest records, it is clear that he was subjected to beating, torture. And the reason he was arrested was because his last name is Kolbe, which is actually a German last name. And even though he didn't speak German, he was not, in his lifetime, his father didn't have any German relatives. The Nazis offered him the opportunity to register as a German Nazi priest and therefore be in a privileged position. He refused. He said, no, I'm Polish. They said, then you're an enemy and you go to the enemy prison. So that's actually why he was arrested, for refusing to sign a document to recognize himself as German and Aryan, despite having German Aryan ancestry. So this is Pawiak prison. It's since been torn down, but they actually have a museum in Warsaw now. Barbara, I don't know if you went to the...
I did, actually.
Did you go to the museum?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, they have a memorial. Heinrich Himmler visited Pawiak prison while he was there in 1941 to address the problem of overcrowding, because with all of these laws changing with the invasion of Poland, they were arresting so many people and didn't have places to put them. So on May 27th, 1941, he was eventually deported from Pawiak prison to Auschwitz. And this is, I looked it up on Google Maps. It's about 300 kilometers, so about 180 miles, but the journey by train took over 16 hours. So that's why I say the deportation took over a day, despite not being too far away. So this is Auschwitz in 1941. And I just want to take a minute just to describe where it is, because we see these pictures of Auschwitz a lot with these brick buildings. And this is Auschwitz I right here. So this little small pink area, that's all Auschwitz, or excuse me, sorry, that's Auschwitz I right there, is that small area right there. It's those 28 brick buildings. If I call your attention over here, you frequently see this building. That's actually Birkenau. That's over a mile away back here. And the gate was there, but the concentration camp Birkenau, where so many Jews were killed and imprisoned, wasn't actually used until 1942. So that's why in 1941, we're still here in Auschwitz I, which was the original site of the Polish military barracks at Auschwitz. It was meant to hold really no more than 5,000 prisoners. But in early 1941, Himmler gave the order to expand the camp to hold more than 30,000 prisoners, which is a very, very high number for a very small camp. So that's why, so that's the main camp. Then there's Auschwitz II Birkenau, which is, you can see, much bigger in comparison. And then later Auschwitz III, also called Buna, which was to staff the IG Farben chemical factory, which is over here on the other side of the town, Auschwitz, which is here, which is also called Oświęcim in Polish. And just to show you where we are on the map, there's Warsaw, so that's where he would have gone on the train ride down to Auschwitz. And Auschwitz is only 30 miles from Krakow, so it's very much a suburb of Krakow, which was the main population center. But at this time, there was not a large population of Jewish prisoners in the camp, because it was mostly Polish prisoners in the year of 1941 at Auschwitz. Just to show you again, for scale, Auschwitz I, which is the only campsite they had in 1941, while Auschwitz II Birkenau was under construction. This is just to show you a plan, a diagram of Auschwitz I. It has 28 of these brick barracks that you see frequently. And by the time Maximilian Kolbe was there, there were about 600 prisoners in each of these barracks. They had no heating, no air conditioning. Obviously, no one had air conditioning in 1941, but it was still too many people. And he arrived at the end of May. So it was summer, but still cool and cold. So then the majority of prisoners were political prisoners, and who were mostly of Polish descent at this time. So they would have been designated with the red upside down triangle, as opposed to the yellow star, which designates the Jewish prisoners. So on May 28th, 1941, he was registered as prisoner number 16,670. And this is a painting of him in the prison uniform that he would have been wearing after his intake. He would have been taken through the intake procedure where he was disinfected, shaved, and then given these denim striped pajamas and wooden clogs and a single bowl for food. And then at this time, I should mention, they did not tattoo the prisoners yet. In 1941, they still only took, they sewed the number onto their clothes, and they did take photographs like this when they came in. Unfortunately, Maximilian Kolbe's photographs were destroyed when Nazis tried to destroy the evidence in the records at the end of World War II. So unfortunately, we don't have his prison photograph. Another prisoner who was in his block with him, in Block 14, was a prisoner named Mstislav Kosilniak. And he is very interesting. He had a slightly lower number than him. So this number actually shows you how many prisoners were in the camp at the time when they were taken in. So his number was 15,261. And he's an artist. And he was able to draw the entire time he was in Auschwitz. He kept his drawings with him. And he was actually forced to work as an artist by the Nazis in the camp. So this is an example of the work that he was forced to make. So he made these posters, this etching that says, "A louse is your death," and it's written in German and in Polish. And then he also was commissioned, well, not commissioned, he was, he was compelled to paint these murals on the cafeteria for the staff at Auschwitz. So this is the only scene. I think they lasted until 1959. They were on the wall. So he was forced to work as an artist, but he was actually still able to make his own paintings and drawings, and they've really been able to survive as a testimony to this experience. This is one picture he had of their roll call scene. So you can see the blocks here, and they would have torturous roll calls where they would get the prisoners up at 4 a.m. and count the thousands of prisoners for hours. They would recount them before sending them off to do manual labor all day. And then they would come back at night, and before they could do anything, they were also forced to stand for hours in all kinds of weather, regardless of injury or illness. So this is just a scene of daily life in the camp. And his art is really a true record of what it was like and from an inmate's perspective. This shows the walk to work. There's Maximilian Kolbe. They would have actually, the work they were doing is they were doing the initial clearing and construction of the larger crematoria that would be made at the Birkenau site. So they were clearing the land for the site that would become Birkenau. So this is them going into the field every day, and they would have been clearing reeds, clearing brush without gloves, shoveling mud, shoveling bricks. Maximilian Kolbe was beaten multiple times by a capo who is an imprisoned overseer. This painting shows them clearing reeds. He ended up going to the infirmary with injuries after he was beaten, but he never lost his faith. He never expressed grief or pain, and everything he did was about encouraging other people. He shared all of the food he had, and he tried to be as emotionally supportive as possible in the limited capacity he could be. He also, despite not being able to celebrate Mass and give prisoners communion, he did hear confessions, he counseled prisoners, and he encouraged them in every way he could. June of 1941, I found out they were still able to write letters from Auschwitz. They were not able to receive mail, but they could send letters out. So he wrote this letter in June 15th, 1941. That's his final work, or final writing, and he wrote, "My dearest mother, towards the end of the month of May, I reached the concentration camp of Auschwitz by rail convoy. Everything is going well with me. Beloved mommy, don't worry about me or about my health, because the good God is everywhere, and with immense love, he thinks about all of us and about everything. It would be best not to write to me until I send you another letter. I don't know how long I shall remain here. With heartfelt greetings and a kiss." And that's the last work we have of him. And it's a week later that the nature of the camp of Auschwitz changes because of the nature of the war. So on June 22nd, 1941, Nazi Germany invades the Soviet Union, and they start having an influx of Soviet POWs. This is actually a picture from the following year, but it just shows you an example of the scale of capture of prisoners of war in the Soviet Union. So throughout the war, they took, the Germans took over 5.7 million Soviet POWs, and 3.3 million of them died in captivity, largely because they did not have the space to put them. And then a week later, or a month later, excuse me, in July 1941, Block 14 that had 600 prisoners, including Maximilian Kolbe and the artist Mstislav Kasilniak, there was an escape. And they, to deter any escapes from Auschwitz, they implemented collective punishment. So after 2 days of searching, they elected to select 10 prisoners to be starved to death in Block 11, which is the punishment block, to deter other prisoners from escape. I should mention that they tortured these prisoners for 2 days. They made them stand while they were looking for the escaped prisoner. They actually found out, somebody found out, the prisoner had not escaped. He had died in the latrine. At this point, it was performance art. They just had to continue with the collective punishment for the escape, despite the fact that no escape had actually occurred. But a prisoner was selected for death, to be starved to death with the 9 other prisoners, and his name was Franciszek Gajowniczek, and he had a very low number. He was a Polish soldier who was captured early. His number was 5,659, and when these selections would happen, the people would be so fearful, they would be silent. They wouldn't say anything. And he cried and said, well, what about my wife and children? And without missing a beat, Maximilian Kolbe offered, he just said, I would like to take his place. And the commandant said, what is your name? And the response that he was supposed to give was, my name is number 16,670. But he said, I'm a Catholic priest. And then Commandant Fritsch said, I don't care which one of you Polish pigs dies. And then he allowed the trade to happen. So what happened after that? Block 11. So Block 11 is down here in the corner. It's labeled as U. It was right next to Block 10, which was the medical experiment block. So it looked very much like the other brick blocks on the outside. Although this one was different. It was down in the corner, and it was specifically for torture and punishment. This is a 3D rendering of it. The top floor would have been rooms that were used for medical examinations, trials. They had a pseudo-judicial procedure where they would try somebody and accuse them all at the same time. And then this is the bottom, the substructure here, which is essentially the basement. But you could see these little windows at the top of the cell, which are here. You can see along the lower part of the wall on the outside, even though this would have been the upper part of the window downstairs. There were 22 cells, excuse me, in here, and all 10 prisoners were chosen to be put into cell 18. So this is how normally prisoners would be executed. Upstairs, they were frequently, at this time, phenol injections, also known as carbolic acid, would have been injected to stop the heart. Frequently, they were sent there. It was administered by a doctor. Sometimes if they were sick, they were sent there, or sometimes if they were just being punished. But unfortunately, Maximilian Kolbe and his group of prisoners were sentenced for a much slower death, which was death by starvation and dehydration. So this is normally how the scene of how the lethal injections would have been administered upstairs. And this is an artist rendering of how the prisoners would be taken into Block 11. They would be beaten. And then this is an image of prisoners all in a cell together downstairs. Maximilian Kolbe's group of prisoners, when they were taken in, they were stripped naked upstairs before being led downstairs to be put into cell 18. After 12 days in the cell, all of the other prisoners died, and they died very slowly. But I should say, to go back to this picture, they left these windows there so that the other prisoners could hear the crying and the yelling and the screaming as a deterrent. But what they heard coming out of cell 18 was very different. It was singing, it was praising, it was hymns. Maximilian Kolbe was using any last voice he had to comfort the other prisoners. And prisoners from all over the camp would come to this window. And Vicki actually asked me earlier, well, why didn't they punish him for singing and encouraging the other prisoners, especially when other prisoners were gathering around? And I honestly don't have a good answer for that, other than I think they realized very quickly that this was turning into a spiritual martyrdom, and they just didn't want to interfere anymore with the perception of that they were killing somebody. So I think they just wanted it to settle down on its own and just let the voices become quieter as they did, as they became weaker. But it was truly a unique execution experience, even for Auschwitz, and it received a lot of attention in the camp and really changed the perspective of a lot of the prisoners. But on August 14th, 1941, all of the other prisoners had died except for Father Maximilian Kolbe. The doctors would go in and check their pulse and their heart rate, and he still had a faint pulse and a heart rate, and he was breathing. And when they came with the phenol injection with the syringe to give him, he calmly showed them his arm, and his final gesture was to bless the man that executed him. And it was at this time that the doctors began to rebel. And they said, after this, I think it really did make an impression, because phenol injections stopped being used after this to kill prisoners, because the doctors did not want to face their prisoner, or did not want to face the person that they were killing, because there was no way they could lie to themselves and say that in some distortion of the Hippocratic Oath that they were helping people. So the doctors refused, and 3 weeks later, in September 3rd, 1941, in the same block, in block 11, down in the cells, they started using the cell as a gas chamber to experiment with Zyklon B. Zyklon B is a byproduct of sugar beet refining, actually. They really started using it in New Orleans. That's when they realized that it actually was great for insecticide if it's used in a contained space. So if you were to use it outside, it comes in these pellets, Zyklon B, and it releases hydrogen cyanide. So in an enclosed space, it'll cause asphyxiation and result in death. But they produced it at the IG Farben plant in Auschwitz. So it was cheap and manufactured right there. So that's why they went with it. It's a very heavy gas, and it takes over 20 minutes to kill the people. So, and pushes the air up, and the Zyklon B is down. So the prisoners, they would always say this, that they form a pyramid, because they would try to get to the top just to get a last gasp of air. But it's after this that they start using gas exclusively as the mechanism for mass execution. In this first execution, they killed 250 sick Polish prisoners and 600 Soviet prisoners of war, because they were having so many Soviet prisoners of war come in, and they didn't have the space to house them at this point. This is a chart just to show you the victims of Auschwitz. At the end of 1941 and then in 1942, that's where you get these large numbers of Jewish victims. So still there were over 1.1 million Jews that were deported to Auschwitz, and 1 million of them were killed. The group we talked about today is this group of Polish prisoners. And there were 140,000 to 150,000 deported, and there were 70 to 75,000 that were killed. So some of these Polish prisoners actually did live a bit longer, just because they were in Auschwitz I as opposed to Birkenau, which was the death camp part of Auschwitz. I should mention Maximilian Kolbe's older brother, Franciszek Kolbe. He was arrested 2 years later in July 1943 as a part of the Polish Home Army, the Resistance Army, and he was taken to Auschwitz and then later transferred to Buchenwald and Mittelbau-Dora, which is a camp in central Germany. It's a concentration camp that's actually inside of a mountain, so it's truly horrifying, because the train would go straight into the mountain, and it was a concentration camp in pitch black with no ventilation, no sanitation, and it's there that they were making the V-2 rockets. And he died in January 1945, tragically, at the end of the war. So in 1942, January, a death certificate was finally issued. So Maximilian Kolbe's mother eventually realized that her son died. So this would have been 6 months after the last letter that he sent her. And it actually says cause of death not recorded. So according to this document, Auschwitz doesn't know how he died. And that's his mother, Mariana, in 1946. So she only lived another year after the war. I should mention that his parents, despite staying married, they opted to go into religious life after they had their children, and they stayed married, but that was something. So his father ended up joining World War I and died in World War I, and his mother went to a convent. So she lived the rest of her life as a Felician sister, and did very much the same work that her sons did. And then she died in 1946. And she did say when she got the letter, all of her sisters that were there with her said that she was sad, her face fell, but she just said, "I knew he would die a martyr." And that's all she said about it. I mentioned before in Nagasaki, the garden that he made at the monastery there, he insisted on building on the other side of the mountain. Well, in August 1945, when the bomb dropped, the whole town was completely obliterated. But because this was on the other side of the mountain, it was entirely protected. And still to this day, they don't know how all of the monks had no effects of radiation. He had the fire equipment, so they were actually able to be the first responders to the blast site, and they were actually able to use their fire truck, and they were able to go and rescue people and treat their wounds and put out fires. And it's still miraculous to this day. So even in Japan, there are so many books that are written by not Christian, not Catholic people who just say that this is agreed in Japan by all of the citizens who were there that this was a miracle that this happened, because they still don't know how they had no effects of the radiation. And they were able to set up really the first field hospital to help as many people as they could. In 1971, Maximilian Kolbe was beatified in the Catholic Church, and Pope John Paul II was actually able to make his first pilgrimage to Poland, which is his home country, in 1979, and a shrine has been set up in cell 18 of block 11. So that's the window there, and that's the cell where he was. And today it's a shrine. This is John Paul II's first official visit in 1979, and he said that in this place of horrendous torture, which brought death to 4 million people of different nations, Father Maximilian Kolbe won a spiritual victory similar to the victory of Christ himself by voluntarily sacrificing himself to death in the starvation bunker in his brother's stead.